Section 3 of Astounding Stories 16, April 1931. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Thornton, Miranda, New Zealand. Astounding Stories 16, April 1931. Monsters of Mars by Edmond Hamilton. Part 3. It was upward they leapt, with all the force of their earthly muscles, towards the big window opening a half-dozen feet in the wall above them. Like released steel springs, they sat up, and Randall heard the thump of their feet as they struck the opening's sill, heard wild cries suddenly coming from beneath them as the guards turned back toward them. Crimson rays clove up like light toward them, but the instant surprise had been enough, and in it they had leapt on and through the opening, into the outside night. As they shot downward and struck the metal paving outside, Randall heard a wild babble of cries from inside. A moment he and Longyear gazed frenziedly around them, then were running with great leaps along the base of the buildings from which they had just escaped. In the darkness of night the Martian city stretched away to their right, its massive dark cone structures outlined by points of glowing ruddy light here and there upon them. Beside the city's metal streets were illuminated by the brilliant field of stars overhead, and by the soft light of the two moons, one much larger than the other, that moved along those stars. Along the street crocodilian Martians were coming and going still, though in small numbers, there being but few in sight in the dim-lit street's length. Longyear pointed ahead as they leapt onward. "Straight onward, Randall," he jerked. "There seem fewer of the Martians this way." "But the great cone of the matter station is the other way," Randall exclaimed. "We can't risk making for it now," cried the other. "We've got to keep clear of them until the alarm is over. Hear them now?" For even as they leapt forward, a rising clamor of hissing cries and rush of feet was coming from behind, as scores of Martians poured out into the darkness from the great cone building. The two fugitives had passed by then from the shadow of the mighty structure, and as they ran along the broad metal street toward the shadow of the next cone, through the light of the moons above, they heard higher cries, and then glimpsed narrow shafts of crimson force cleaving the night around them. Randall, as the deadly rays drove past him, heard the low detonating sound made by the destruction of the air in their path, and the inrush of new air. But in the misty and uncertain moonlight the rays could not be loosed accurately, and before they could be swept sideways to annihilate the two fleeing men, they had gained with a last great leap the shadow of the next building. On they ran, the clatter of the Martian pursuit growing more noisy behind them. Randall heard Longyear gasping with each great leap, and felt himself at every breath a knife of pain stabbing through his lungs, the rarefied atmosphere of the red planet taking its toll. Again from the darkness behind them the crimson rays clove, but this time were wide of their mark. With every moment the clamor of pursuit seemed growing louder, the alarm spreading out over the Martian city and arousing it. As they raced past cone after cone, Randall knew even the increased power of their muscles could not long aid them against the exhaustion which the thin air was imposing on them. His thoughts spun for a moment to Milton, in the laboratory behind, and then back to their own desperate plight. Abruptly, shapes loomed in the misty light before them. A group of three great Martians, reptilian shapes that had been coming toward them and had stopped for an instant in amazement at sight of the running pair. There was no time to halt themselves to evade the three, and with a mutual instinct Longyear and Randall seized together the last expedient open to them. They ran straight forward towards the astounded three, and when a half-score feet from them, leapt with all their force upward and toward them, their tense bodies flying through the air with feet outstretched before them. Then they had struck the group of three with feet foremost, and with the impetus of that great leap had knocked them sprawling to this side and that, while with a supreme effort the two kept their balance and leapt on. The cries of the three added to the din behind them as they threw themselves forward. They flung themselves past a last cone building to halt for an instant in utter amazement despite the nearing pursuit. Before them were no more streets and structures, but a huge, smooth-flowing waterway. It gleamed in the moonlight, and lay at right angles across their path, seeming to flow along the Martian city's edge. "A canal!" cried Lanier. "It's one of the canals that meet at this city and flow around it. We're trapped. We've reached the city's edge." "Not yet," Randall gasped. "Look!" As he pointed to the left, Lanier shot a glance there, and then both of them were running in that direction, along the smooth metal paving that bordered the mighty canal. They came to what Randall had seen, a mighty metal arch that soared out over the waterway to its opposite side. A bridge! They were on it, were racing up the smooth incline of it. Randall glanced back as they reached the arch's summit. From that height the city stretched far away behind them, a lace of crimson lights in the night. He glimpsed the gleam of the giant waterway that encircled the city completely, one that was fed by other canals from far away that emptied into it, the great city's vital water supply brought thus from this world's melting polar snows. There were moving lights behind now, too, pouring out of the metal paving by the waterway, moving to and fro as if in confusion, with a babble of hissing cries. It was not until Randall and Lanier were running down the descending incline of the great arch bridge, though, that the lights and shouts of their pursuers began to move up onto that bridge after them. Running off the bridge's smooth way, the two found themselves stumbling on through the darkness over more metal paving, and then over soft ground. There were no lights or buildings or sounds of any sort on this farther side of the great waterway. A tall dark wall seemed suddenly to loom up out of the darkness some distance ahead of the two. "The Crimson Jungle!" Randall cried. "The jungles we glimpsed from the city! It's a chance to hide!" They raced towards the protecting blackness of the wall of vegetation. They reached it, flung themselves inside, just as the pursuing Martians, a mass of running crocodilian shapes and of great racing centipede machines, swept up over the bridge's arch behind. A moment the two halted in the thick vegetation shelter, gasping for breath, then were moving forward through the jungle's denser darkness. Thick about them and far above them towered the masses of strange trees and plant life through which they made their way. Randall could see but dimly the nature of these plant forms, but could make out that they were grotesque and unearthly in appearance, all leafless, and with masses of thin tendrils branching from them instead of leaves. He realized that it was only beside the arid planet's great canals that this profusion of plant life had sufficient moisture for existence, and that it was the broad bands of jungle bordering the canals that had made the latter visible to Earth's astronomers. Lanier and he halted for a moment to listen. The thick jungle about them seemed quite silent. But from behind there came through it a vague tumult of hissing calls, and then, as they glimpsed red flashes far behind, they heard the crashing of great masses of the leafless trees. "The rays!" whispered Lanier. "They're beating through the jungle with them and the centipede machines after us." They paused no more, but pushed on through the thick growths with renewed urgency. Now and then, as they passed through small clearings, Randall glimpsed overhead the fast-moving nearer moon and slower-sailing farther moon of Mars, moving across the steady stars. In some of these clearings they saw, too, strange great openings burrowed in the ground as though by some strange animal. The crashing clamor of the Martians beating the jungle behind was coming close, ever closer, and as they came to still another misty-lit clearing, Lanier paused, with face white and tense. "They're closing in on us," he said. "They're hunting us down by beating the jungle with those centipede machines, and even if we escape them, we're farther from the city and the matter station each moment." Randall's eyes roved desperately around the clearing, and then, as they fell on a group of the great burrowed openings that seemed present everywhere about them, he uttered an exclamation. "These holes! We can hide in one until they've passed over us, and then steal back to the city." Lanier's eyes lit. "It's a chance." They sprang towards the openings. They were each of some 4 feet diameter, extending indefinitely downward, as though through the mouths of tunnels. In a moment Randall was lowering himself into one, Lanier after him. The tunnel in which they were, they found, curved to one side a few feet below the surface. They crawled down this curve until they were out of sight of the opening above. They crouched silent, then listening. There came down to them the dull, distant clamor of the centipede machines crashing through the jungle, cutting away with rays, their clamor growing ever louder. Then Randall, who was the lowest in the tunnel, turned suddenly as there came to him a strange rustling sound from beneath him. It was as though some crawling or creeping thing was moving in the tunnel below them. He grasped the arm of Lanier beside, and a little above him, to warn him, but the words he was about to whisper never were uttered, for at this moment a big, shapeless, living thing seemed to flash up towards them through the darkness from beneath. Cold, rope-like tentacles gripped both tightly, and then, in an instant, they were being dragged irresistibly down into the lightless tunnel's depths. As they were pulled swiftly down into the tunnel by the tentacles that grasped them, an involuntary cry of horror came from Randall and Lanier alike. They twisted frantically in the cold grip that held them, but found it of the quality of steel. And as Randall twisted in it to strike frantically down through the darkness or whatever thing of horror held them, his clenched fist met the cold, smooth skin of some big, soft-bodied creature. Down, down, remorselessly they were being drawn farther into the black depths of the tunnel by the great thing crawling down below them. Again and again the two twisted and struck, but could not shake its hold. In sheer exhaustion they ceased to struggle, dragged helplessly farther down. Was it minutes or hours, Randall wondered afterwards, of that horrible progress downward that passed before they glimpsed light beneath? A feeble glow, hardly discernible it was, and as they went lower still, he saw that it was caused by the tunnel passing through a strata of radioactive rock that gave off the faint light. In that light they glimpsed for the first time the horror dragging them downward. It was a huge worm creature, a thing like a giant angleworm, 3 feet or more in thickness and thrice that in length, its great body soft and cold and worm-like. From the end nearest them projected 2 long tentacles with which it had gripped the 2 men and was dragging them down the tunnel after it. Randall glimpsed a mouth aperture in the tentacled end of the worm body also, and 2 scar-like marks above it, placed like eyes, although eyes the monstrous thing had not. But a moment they glimpsed it, and then were in darkness again as the tunnel passed through the radioactive strata and lower. The horror of that moment's glimpse, though, made them strike out in blind repulsion, but relentlessly the creature dragged them after it. "God!" It was Lanier's panting cry as they were dragged on. "This worm monster! We're hundreds of feet below the surface!" Randall sought to reply, but his voice choked. The air about them was close and damp, with an overpowering earthy smell. He felt consciousness leaving him. A gleam of soft light. They were passing more radioactive patches. He felt the wild, convulsive struggles of Lanier against the thing, and then suddenly the tunnel ended, debouched into a far-stretching, low-ceilinged cavity. It was feebly illuminated by radioactive patches here and there in walls and ceiling, and as the monster that held them halted on entering the cavity, Randall and Lanier lay in its grip and stared across the weird place with intensified horror. For it was swarming with countless worm monsters. All were like the one who held them, thick, long worm bodies with projecting tentacles and with black, eyeless faces. They were crawling to and fro in this cavern far beneath the surface, swarming in hordes around and over each other, pouring in and out of the awful place from countless tunnels that led upward and downward from it. A world of worm monsters beneath the surface of the Martian jungles. As Randall stared across that swarming, dim-lit cave of horror, physically sick at the sight of it, he remembered the countless tunnel openings they had glimpsed in their flight through the jungle, and remembered the remark of the Martian who had first guided them across the city, that in the jungles were living things of a sort. These were the things, worm monsters whose unthinkable networks of tunnels and burrows formed beneath the surface a veritable worm world. "Randall!" It was Lanier's thick exclamation. "Randall, those scar marks on their faces, you see?" "See?" "Those marks! These creatures had eyes once, but must have been forced down here by the Martians. These may once have been, ages ago, human." At that thought Randall felt horror overcoming his senses. He was aware that the great worm monster holding them was dragging them forward through the cavern, that others of the swarms there were crowding around them, feeling them blindly with their tentacles, helping to drag them forward. Half carried and half dragged they went, scores of tentacles now holding them, great worm shapes crawling forward on all sides of them and accompanying them along the cavern's length. He glimpsed worm monsters here and there emerging from the upward tunnels with masses of strange plant stuff in their grasp that others blindly devoured. His senses reeled from the suffocating air, the great cavity being but a half-score feet in height, burrowed from the damp earth by these numberless things. The faint, strange light of the radioactive patches showed him that they were approaching the cavern's end. Tunnels opened from its end as from all its walls and floor, and into one Randall was dragged by the creatures, one before and one behind, grasping him, and Lanier being brought behind him in the same way. In the close tunnel the heavy air was deadly, and he was but partly conscious when again, after moments of crawling along it, he felt himself dragged out into another cavern. This earth-world cavity, though, seemed to extend farther than the first, though of the same height as the first and with a few radioactive illuminating patches. In it seethed and swarmed literally hundreds on hundreds of the worm monsters, a sea of great crawling bodies. Randall and Lanier saw that they were being carried and dragged now toward the farther end of this larger cavity. As they approached it, pushing through the swarming creatures who felt them with inquisitive tentacles as their captors took them forward, the two men saw that a great shape was looming up in the faint light at the cave's far end. In moments they were close enough to discern its nature, and a horror and awe filled them at sight of it more intense than they had yet felt. For the looming shape was a huge earthen image or statue of a worm. It was shaped with a childish crudeness from the solid earth, a giant earthen worm shape whose body looped across the cave's end, and whose tentacled head or front end was reared upward to the cavity's roof. Before this awful earthen shape was a section of the cave's floor higher than the rest, and on it a great crudely shaped rectangular earthen block. "Lanier, that shape!" whispered Randall in his horror. "That earthen image made by these creatures! It's the worm god they've made for themselves." "A worm god?" Lanier repeated, staring towards it as they were dragged nearer. "Then that block—" "Its altar!" Randall exclaimed. "These things have some dim spark of intelligence or memory. They've brought us here to—" End of Part 3 of Monsters of Mars by Edmond Hamilton.